Hello, welcome to my Beethoven live stream series. Um, One of the things I think that we lost this year with COVID and the shutdown of all the concerts was the ability to kind of celebrate the 250th anniversary of Beethoven. That was something that were going to probably be, series of the symphonies, chamber music. We would get to revel in the greatness of what Beethoven has accomplished. And certainly that's something that I was, planning on doing too. I was planning on a series of doing the 32 sonatas in a cycle, and hopefully doing some talks along with it too. And so it really is still unsure about how soon we will be able to get back to normal concert life and big gatherings in smaller spaces and all of that. And so I thought I'd go ahead and at least do something for Beethoven while it's still at least the season of his 250th birthday before he turns 251. So one of my activities during this year, when obviously concerts were suspended and there wasn't a lot to immediately to practice for, is I was thinking, well, as soon as things are back to normal, I want to be working on this Beethoven cycle. And so, of course, the first thing I did is I said, well, let's take some time and practice and review a whole lot of sonatas. And I thought I'll start with the ones that I haven't looked at that much in recent times. I mean, very few programs ever go by that I don't feel that I want to include a Beethoven sonata, but I found that I've always been gravitating toward all those great late sonatas and the heaven-storming middle sonatas and all these really, really big pieces. And I hadn't performed any of the really earlier ones in quite a while, with a couple of exceptions. And so I began practicing these pieces again, and becoming reacquainted with them, just realized how much variety and beauty and interest there is in all of these pieces. Beethoven was a different person as a young man before the sort of vicissitudes of a life kind of wore him down a little bit. The deafness, the ongoing health issues, his difficulties with kind of making connections with other people in the world. They were written at a time when he was young, in his early and mid-20s, and was getting incredibly successful in his first years in Vienna, and was feeling very, very happy and optimistic about that. And that basic sort of joyousness of nature is certainly evident in all of these early sonatas. In some ways they're not even, often one looks at it and thinks, oh yeah, these late sonatas, which are some of the greatest works of art in all of history, and those middle sonatas that are, again, landmarks in the piano repertoire. Really in many ways these earlier sonatas are not lesser, they're just different. I mean, Beethoven was still the genius he later became, or even in these very, very, very early pieces. So I guess first what I'd like to do today, a little more, probably talk more than I will in some of the later ones, because I want to give sort of a little bit of an overview of Beethoven and his life during this period. And I also want to be able to, talk a little bit about sonatas and what they were, the history, the sonata form, what Beethoven was actually doing in these pieces. And also a great deal of what I might talk about when I get to the individual pieces will be kind of describing how he put them together and what he did that's different from other, from some of the other sonatas. Because Beethoven, the one thing that's amazing about these 32 sonatas, the reason why we play this cycle of 32 sonatas rather than play complete cycles of other important composers' sonatas, is just that Beethoven approached every one of them differently. Every one of them has a different approach to the form, to the proportions of the movements, number of movements, where the intellectual weight of the sonata goes, where is the emotional weight of the sonata. It's a constant change. Some are very, very large and grand. Some are very incredibly compact and terse, with everything in between. And in some ways, these 32 sonatas, like almost like a compendium of everything, every way you could approach writing a sonata. I mean, a little bit like, they've obviously been compared to, as a body of work, Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, where that essentially was Bach maybe putting down for posterity everything that he knew, which was basically more than anyone ever in history ever has, about counterpoint and contrapuntal technique and writing fugues, and then in the preludes, how to kind of write in all sorts of freer styles, from very, very improvisatory to rather, more more organized kind of improvisatory styles. Almost like if you study those pieces, you would have like a doctoral course in everything that's known about composition in the year 1723. And in many ways, these Beethoven sonatas, for anyone, are almost this sort of, you could study them and learn everything there is to know about developing themes, combining them together, forms, balances, variety, contrast, how to use the piano in all sorts of interesting and effective ways. So I think what I'd like to begin with right now is talk a little bit about Beethoven's life at this point, or up to this point. The sonatas that I'll be dealing with were written over a fairly short time. The first one that I'll be talking about today probably started maybe as early as 1793, but it was published in 1795. And the last sonata I'll do in the series, the 7th Opus 10 number 3, was published in 1798. And they certainly show Beethoven's great evolution over these very, very few years of his early life in Vienna. Roughly covering his age from 23 to 27. Anyway, we probably all know roughly the story of Beethoven's life, but just to kind of lay out the general outlines of it, so it's all in everyone's consciousness at the time. Right now, he was born in Bonn in Germany in 1770. His father was a tenor who worked at the court in Bonn. Beethoven's grandfather, who was also named Ludwig, had been the court Kapellmeister in Bonn for a number of years and was a very, very respected and revered figure. And so the Beethoven family, had a certain stature there. Though Beethoven's father was something of a mediocre musician who was kept on at the court as a tenor, basically in deference to his father, Beethoven's grandfather's position and influence. The father was something of a ne'er-do-well, never could live up to the expectations set up by what his father had set forth for him. They often had great conflicts about how serious and how he was living his life. And among the few things that we have recorded that are interactions between them was his father reprimanding him for, basically, Johann von Beethoven, Beethoven's father. Among his things he liked to do was just skip town, go to some other town, and hang out in taverns for several days and just disappear, for days at a time. And of course, there was actually a history of alcoholism in the Beethoven family. The first Ludwig, Beethoven's grandfather's wife, actually succumbed very, very badly to alcoholism, and actually was sent for the last 10 years or so of her life to live in a convent because it was so out of control. Anyway, at least early on in their life, the Beethoven family was probably moderately happy. They were part of a large circle of people around them who all were connected to the court, Beethoven had certainly a number of friends in his young years and in his teens. Certainly, as things grew on, though, his father's alcoholism fairly quickly got much worse, and so by the time Beethoven was 10 or 12, that was becoming a real problem. Johann also wasn't a person to kind of stick to things and try to really work his way up to kind of achieve stability for his family. He was always looking for quick solutions. So what's a quick way to kind of like make a lot of money? So after his father died and the position of court Kapellmeister was available, he applied for it, even though he really had none of the qualifications to be successful in such a demanding job. But his way of trying to apply for it was he took things that he'd inherited from his father and used them to bribe some of the officials, just give them nice gifts of all sorts of nice little objects that his grandfather had accumulated over the years, and see if that could influence them to give him the job. Needless to say, he was not given it, and perhaps one of his next ideas was, this little boy Ludwig here appears to have some musical talent. Perhaps I can make him into something of a child prodigy, a little bit like Mozart, and that could make my, make our lives a little bit easier. And so Beethoven, when he Beethoven wrote his very first pieces around the age of 8 or 9, variations on a march by a composer named Dressler. And Johann got those published, and he, of course, said that Beethoven, instead of being 8 years old, was 6 years old when he wrote them. And that's on the title page to this day. And that caused a great deal of confusion in Beethoven's mind. He actually seemed to be unsure of how old he actually was, really until he was around 40 or so. And he often gave his age as 2 years younger than what it actually was. Johann, we often have that legend that Johann would make Beethoven, wake him up in the middle of the night and practice to all hours so that he can realize Johann's ambitions. There might be, don't really know, but there might be some truth to this. There's at least one accounting of Johann and one of Beethoven's early teachers were drinking companions, and they came back from a tavern late at night, and they did wake Beethoven up, and they said, "Let's make him practice." It did happen at least once. Johann did take Beethoven even on a few sort of tours to sort of northern Germany to actually perform at houses of nobility and to meet people. Actually did receive some money from that. By the time Beethoven was 12, right getting into his early teens, he was introduced for his newest teacher was Christian Gottlieb Neffe, who was a substantial and well-educated musician, and really probably the ideal person for Beethoven to be to meet at that time. He's someone who wasn't interested in just the superficial or flashy types of music that might have been fashionable at the time. He was one of the very, very few people who know the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. I mean, the great Bach his music had fallen totally into eclipse by this time, and most professional musicians were not acquainted with the music. It was all in manuscript anyway. You could only play it if you had access to some manuscript copy of it. And it's really very significant. We're talking about the year 1785 right now. It wasn't until 1781 that both Mozart and Haydn really became acquainted with Johann Sebastian Bach's music. And immediately that changed their sort of compositional style, and Mozart became much more contrapuntal, as did Haydn. And immediately, both Mozart and Haydn immediately wrote some string quartets that incorporated fugues, which they had learned from Bach. Anyway, so one of the things that Neffe gave to Beethoven was the well-tempered clavier. And Beethoven played from this, and it's even said by Neffe that he played principally from that, which one could imagine, considering how much music there is and how difficult and involved and complex these pieces are. You can imagine him playing nothing but that for a very, very long time. And I've often thought that that's perhaps one of those influences that caused Beethoven's music from such a young age often to have so much emotional depth. And in some ways, a lot of the late 18th century, the music tended to be a lighter and that sort of gallant, rather pleasing style. And why did Beethoven gravitate toward a more substantial style emotionally, and then have that sort of more romantic sensibility in his music? I've often thought that's because he got that from that great emotional depth that is in Bach's music. Right around this time, when Beethoven was, I believe, 12 or so, Neffe actually wrote to the court asking Beethoven to be hired as his assistant so that he could kind of work as the court organist and play in the orchestras and all of that. And among his things was that to help the family to subsist, because the father was no longer able to provide the support for young Beethoven and his family. So the father was very much getting into really succumbing to drink at this point. If we go a couple years later, by 1787, when Beethoven was 17, Beethoven himself actually petitioned the court to have basically his father's salary transferred to him, because the father really was not able to negotiate his duties. And at that point, basically Beethoven took over his position at the court, and the father was kind of out of the picture at that time, lost his position as a tenor there. Through this period, 12 to 15, Beethoven made great strides as a composer. He wrote his first piano sonatas, 3 sonatas that he wrote when he was 12. Really very, very creditable pieces of a very, very high professional level, very, very well constructed, quite ambitious, varied. They really show that he, at least in these pieces, he was writing something that could be considered comparable to what Mozart was doing at that age. His other big achievement during this time was 3 piano quartets that he wrote at the age 14 to 15, which are also very, very, very fine pieces. And very, very interestingly, some of the melodies that he wrote in there later went into his Opus 2 piano sonatas. And the sonata that we'll be talking about today, the Opus 2 number 1, the slow movement melody, comes from that one of the piano quartets. In his later teens, after that age 15, Beethoven did not compose very much for a few years, and it's very, very interesting that the pieces that we find from that era are rather fragmentary and rather light and insignificant and really not at all interesting, and they don't in any way, to me, really are prophetic of who he turned into. He's probably spending most of this time working hard at the court, helping to support the family. He was probably practicing a great deal at this time and improvising a great deal. We have sketchbooks that go back to this era, and you could see that he was notating things that he would improvise and interesting cadenzas, interesting ideas that he would later come back to in many years. But basically from 1785 to 1790, he composed very, very little and nothing of significance. In 1790, the elector, the head, basically the count who was the head of the court in Bonn, died, and a new elector was inaugurated. And Beethoven wrote 2 giant cantatas, one on the death of the previous elector and the other for the coronation of the new elector. And these start to show the sort of potential that Beethoven really had in their ambition and their drama and variety and emotional impact. Still nothing of that real mastery that he was to have just a few years later, but at least a step in the right direction. In his later years in Bonn, he wrote quite a number of other pieces. Again, lighter, not all that terribly significant, but probably he was starting the second piano concerto, which certainly is one of his first and earliest, really mature pieces. Oh, one other thing that we certainly should mention happened at this time that's really important is at the age of 16, Beethoven's sort of people watching in Bonn as a relatively small city, and the people in power, the people who were attached to the court, they knew about this sort of talented young man who might make their city, put their city on the map artistically. And they were watching out for him, knowing the ups and downs of his family. And a plan was hatched that he should go to Vienna, perhaps to meet Mozart. It's not really recorded why. And perhaps to study with Mozart, basically to further his career and education there. Beethoven did travel to Vienna. He did meet Mozart at least once. Again, we don't know whether these stories are really true or not, but supposedly he went to meet Mozart, first played something that a pre-written piece that he knew would probably impress Mozart, perhaps something from one of Mozart's concerti or something like that. And Mozart's reply, "Oh, anyone can play that. I'm not interested in that." And then Beethoven supposedly asked him, "Well, please, may I have something that I can a melody I can improvise upon?" Mozart gave him something, and Beethoven exhibited his incredible talent at improvisation. Beethoven very likely, from what people write about accounts of how he sounded in improvisation, he might have been the greatest improviser in history. And this did impress Mozart, and while Beethoven was playing, he supposedly went over to people who were in the next room and said, "Keep an eye on this young man. He'll give you something to talk about someday." Beethoven, later on, in his recollection, sometimes he actually said he'd never met Mozart, but at other times he mentioned that he had, and he thought that Mozart's piano playing left something to be desired. Beethoven was a piano playing of a new generation, and Mozart was sort of old-fashioned, had grown up on the harpsichord. And Beethoven, actually it's important to note that he was probably that first generation who pretty much grew up playing the piano from a young age, and his entire style was dedicated to the piano. And he describes Mozart's playing as being choppy and not having any legato. And there's a possibly apocryphal phrase that Beethoven was what he said, that he described Mozart's piano technique as manual air sawing, which the sort of colorful metaphor that he uses is actually very, very typical of how Beethoven in later years expressed himself. He always came up with colorful little phrases like that that were really quite unique, and certainly they conjure up that sort of feeling of high fingers and moving them way too much for playing on the piano, with a lot of perhaps tension in them, which would be appropriate for harpsichord playing. Beethoven was very much spent a great deal of time cultivating his legato, and was well known for keeping his fingers very, very close to the keys in the sort of more modern way. Actually, another little aside about that: people who studied with him during his early years, when he actually did some teaching, they would remark about how their previous teachers had taught them, flat fingers and a high wrist and all this thing that was very harpsichord oriented. And they say that Beethoven never tired of holding down their fingers and making them curved and keeping their fingers close to the keys. So in many ways, he's probably the person who invented modern piano technique. So back to Beethoven. Got a chance to meet Mozart briefly, but after he'd been in Vienna for about 2 weeks, he received word that his mother was dying from tuberculosis in Bonn, and he immediately rushed back to try to see her before she died, but he was too late, and so he never got to see her again. At this point, with the father, the head of the family, basically being totally dysfunctional, Beethoven had to stay and attend to his duties at the court to basically support his two younger brothers. And so it wasn't until 1793, and he's now 22, that the idea again came up that he should go to Vienna, this time hopefully to study with Haydn, who was then at the height of his career and was the most famous composer in the world. And this was a Count von Waldstein, who was resident of Bonn at the time, who basically pushed this sort of plan through and got Beethoven to Vienna. And Waldstein kind of falls out of Beethoven's biography. There isn't much that he had to do with him later on, but he did dedicate one of his greatest sonatas to this count, and certainly that's a sort of a fitting tribute to the help that this man gave Beethoven at just the right moment in his life. Beethoven went to Vienna. He worked with Haydn, took up counterpoint and all sorts of serious musical subjects. Haydn, of course, was very, very distracted. He was getting ready to go to London. He was working on his symphonies for London. He wasn't a pedagogue. He wasn't someone who specialized in that sort of thing. And perhaps Haydn was a little negligent in how he taught Beethoven. We certainly have these counterpoint exercises that Beethoven did for Haydn, and often Haydn let all sorts of little errors go. And at one point, Haydn left for London. There was talk of taking Beethoven, but somehow that never came through, probably because Beethoven and Haydn had a somewhat uneasy relationship. I should talk about a little bit of Beethoven's character at this point. With that sort of difficult upbringing that he had, Beethoven was rather suspicious of people, rather mercurial in temperament. He was very, very quick to jump to that someone might have insulted him or wronged him or wanting to cheat him, and then there would be a big shouting match and an argument, and some big blow up, and then days, hours, days, a week later or whatever, Beethoven would think the better of it. Someone would explain to him what actually had happened, and Beethoven would write some letter or try to contact the person, apologizing profusely and begging them to take him back into their confidences. And this is a sort of a pattern that happened with Beethoven in his relationships his entire life. He had a very, very hard time keeping any sort of relationship for any great amount of time, more than a year or two or a few years. And there are just a few people whose lives, friends who stayed with Beethoven for many, many years. Beethoven was also rather unmannered, uncouth. When he first, arrived in Vienna, there's someone who describes him as having a accent from the provinces, and not even speaking well in that dialect that he had, and that he was ill dressed and carelessly dressed, and also he is dressed himself not in the old-fashioned manner of wigs and powdered wigs and all that, like Haydn would have been and other composers were. He was someone of the modern era who was in the French manner, where you would have your hair cut in a certain way, and you never wore a wig, and you were much more casual in your dress. And he was very, very noticeable. It was known that when he was first in Vienna, if there was some soiree, a musical event, he'd peek in the door and he'd look around and see if there's anyone who annoyed him who he was there. And if he saw someone he didn't like, he just would take off. And if anyone came by who he didn't mind just leaving. He loved to, as a young man, he went to concerts often. He always attended the opera, the symphonies. He wanted to hear all the new music that was going there. He didn't hesitate to walk in late, and then he'd come in and often sit right up in the front row. This might have been a little later, when possibly that was due to his hearing starting to go. But he would go there, he'd sit there for a while. If he thought the music was worthy of hearing, he'd stay there. And if he listened to a few minutes of it and he didn't like it, he'd just get up and walk out. And everyone knew that's Beethoven, that's who he was. Anyway, back to his relations with Haydn. They were always a little bit difficult. Here's Haydn, the greatest composer in the world, someone who had worked incredibly hard and essentially brought himself up from basically nothing to becoming this world-famous personality. And there was this young upstart Beethoven who thought he could be the greatest composer that ever lived, but he really had done nothing yet. And Haydn nicknamed him the Great Mogul. Haydn was a little bemused and amused by his young student, but Beethoven felt competitive with his teacher, and I'm sure his teacher felt no competition whatsoever with this young little guy under his charge. Anyway, after Haydn left for England, he sent Beethoven to Albrecht Berger, who was a famous teacher of counterpoint, and Beethoven studied with him and really perfected it. Albert Berger had the pedantry to kind of really give Beethoven all of this information and compositional technique that he then used for the rest of his life. Haydn actually was very, very helpful to the young Beethoven. He obviously introduced him to many patrons who were the people who commissioned Beethoven's early works. He introduced Beethoven to people who became his students, or their sons and daughters became his students. He got his first pieces published by Haydn's publisher. Haydn gave Beethoven opportunities to play at musicales and soirees. was really a helpful thing. Beethoven, perhaps he didn't like to be indebted to someone in that way. He always kind of downplayed the relationship with Haydn. He didn't want to be in Haydn's shadow his whole life. And one of the things that kind of led to, I won't say a break, but a bigger break between Beethoven and Haydn was when, in 1795, the first 3 piano trios, Opus 1, were published. And the third one, in C minor, is, even to this day, I think everyone would say it's everyone's favorite. It's the most dramatic, it's the most Beethovenian, it's the most radical, it's the most, has that sort of revolutionary emotional world that only Beethoven had. Haydn, when they were to be published, recommended to Beethoven, he advised him not to publish one, so hold it back a little bit. Because Haydn thought, well, for a young composer, this is not a very good thing for a young composer to kind of put something so radical before anyone else. Before he got known by like more mild pieces that wouldn't put people off. And Beethoven took this as, this is the challenge. That's the best one. You're jealous. You're telling me not to publish the best one of all of these. And so that led to sort of like a little bit of bad feeling between Beethoven and Haydn for quite a number of years. Though later on, Haydn attended Beethoven's premieres, and they all kept in touch. And when Haydn was ill later on in his life, Beethoven did go to visit him. So it certainly was not a complete break. We also talk about Beethoven establishing himself as a pianist and composer in these early years. This is now getting to the time when he actually wrote these early sonatas. Beethoven, as a pianist, was definitely the most advanced pianist of his day. There was an orchestral use of the piano that he was, certainly one of the very, very first to do, and a certain level of virtuosity and types of figurations that very few other pianists did. Maybe only people who might have foreshadowed him in this would have been Clementi and Jan Ladislav Dušek, also a very, very well-known pianist who wrote many pieces. And Clementi certainly used octaves and double thirds at times. Haydn used double thirds, but Beethoven trills, thirds, double notes, octave passages, running passages all over the piano with arpeggios. These are all things that he did that if you listen to early Beethoven and listen to Mozart, you could see how they were coming from absolutely different places as to what their music was like. Beethoven, in some ways, you can look at it as one of the first composers who wrote music that's truly was not imaginable for any other instrument. Nearly everything that, say, Haydn and Mozart wrote, you could probably transcribe it as, for some other instrumental media, and the figurations would work out. It would work more or less well. Whereas once you get to some of Beethoven's early pieces, especially, for example, the fourth movement of the Opus 2 Number 1 Sonata, I'll be talking about later, is really unimaginable on any media other than piano and having the same emotional impact. And so Beethoven appeared very, very often in the salons of the aristocracy, performing, improvising, playing his early music. I talked about him being the greatest improviser, perhaps, of all time. Everybody talked about the impact that left people, almost stunned and speechless, sometimes in tears afterward. Beethoven at least pretended to be very, very annoyed by this. He would make fun of the people, and he said, "You're all fools that you will act this way. A real artist just wants applause. I don't want any of this." That he was almost rude and dismissive of them. Almost one of these things that almost like added to his appeal. That was his sort of eccentricity. It made him almost more famous because of that. He made several. He wrote the first piano concerto, which is actually the second, and performed that regularly. Made several tours to neighboring places around Vienna. Went to Prague once. everything was going really, really well. His music was being published. It was being commissioned and played by members of the aristocracy. And as I say, everything was very, very well. It wasn't until 1797-98 where he had, kind of a series of bad illnesses, and then after that point noticed his hearing starting to disappear, that sort of like affected him, and perhaps that is what made his music take a sort of a darker, more emotionally, perhaps substantial turn. Okay, I think I've given something of an idea of the young Beethoven, how he got to the point where he was writing these particular pieces. I should also mention a little bit more about his character, and I think I touched a little bit on that sort of rudeness, not wanting to adhere to sort of social niceties. And that people, even the members of the aristocracy, because they were admiring his talent so much, they kind of put up with this. And he was able to almost play that up a little bit. But also to know, because of how he'd been brought up, and he'd always been someone who was so self-possessed about his level of ability, he never really ever learned how to deal with people, or how to read them, or how to properly build a relationship. And I think that was one of the things that did it hinder his career throughout his life? Perhaps not, but it's something that added to a sort of a distress, a accumulated sadness that he never had these close relationships that he so craved, throughout the rest of his life. Okay, I'd like to move on now to talking about sonata form, and let's see, one of the things I believe I forgot to bring with me for a moment. I forgot to bring my water bottle, and so I am going to adjourn for a moment and just get my glass of water, and I will return momentarily. So now I'd like to speak about sonatas and sonata form and a little bit of the history behind all of that. Sonata form and sonatas were, I guess, one of the biggest, most influential forms developed in classical music. Essentially, in these sonata type forms, everything that we know of, string quartets, piano trios, symphonies, all of these large multi-movement works are all written in some version of these sonata forms. And there's also a very, very specific single movement sonata form about the internal sort of organization of at least one movement in most of these types of pieces. Sonatas. Later on, after Beethoven's death, sonata form was formally codified and defined by theorists and then taught as something. But in Beethoven's lifetime, and in Haydn and Mozart, and through Schubert's lifetime too, the great sonata composers, what a sonata was had never really been codified. It's one of these things everyone knew what it was, but it was kind of an evolving form, and that is why Beethoven's sonatas are so incredibly varied in how they're put together. Say, in contrast to sort of Brahms sonata form pieces, which, as beautifully constructed as they are, and they do kind of go against some of the things that they're supposed to do. It's much more limited, the kind of transgressions that Brahms will make against what the form was supposed to be, because by the time he came along, it had been theoretically codified, what it was. And so as I say, for Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, it was this gradually evolving form. They knew exactly what it was. There were a few sort of requirements that they always knew would happen, but it was, again, nothing that they felt they had to kind of adhere to exactly the way that it was often taught to music students later on. So I guess I'd talk about the external form, the multi-movement form first, the larger scheme of things. Your typical sort of symphonic form would be the sort of fast, rather substantial first movement, kind of like the intellectual weight of the piece. Followed by a long, slower movement that usually would have much of the emotional impact of the piece. And then after that, a lighter dance-like movement, often a minuet, classical era, court dance in 3/4 time, which again would be lighter and much simpler in form. And then the final movement, finale, would be something fast and usually a little bit lighter in spirit than the first movement. And so that's kind of the received sort of idea that Beethoven had. Composers earlier on tended to sometimes write things with 2 movements, 3 movements, 4 movements, and Beethoven's sonatas reflect that. The early ones, where he was being very ambitious and wanted to make a big statement in the piano sonata form, he took on the symphony form, which was mostly 4 movements. Later on, as he sort of started using the forms more for what he felt he wanted to express with that particular idea, with that particular piece, he used different numbers of movements. Externally, the sort of the sonata, this multi-movement sonata, probably came from the idea of the Baroque suites, which often had like a fairly substantial, prelude or first movement, and then a whole bunch of dance movements after that. And sometimes the last one might be a little bit more substantial and contrapuntal or whatever. So not all that similar, all that dissimilar really. And then maybe we should talk next about the internal, sonata form. Typically, the first movement of most sonatas is in what's called sonata form. And if I, maybe I could talk about which I would like to describe as the academic sonata form first, which essentially says that there's a first theme in one key. It's followed by some sort of transition passage, and then there is a second melody, that is now in a new key, and usually that will be in the key 5 notes higher than the original key. That 5 being the key that has the most sort of inner tension with the original key. Often there will be what's called a little closing theme after that sort of second theme that kind of ties everything together, and that first section of the sonata comes to an end. This first section is called the exposition. After the exposition would be what's called the development section, which in general is considered to, composers can do whatever they want there. Usually they'll take the melodies that have shown up in the exposition and do them in different keys, break them apart, recombine them, modulate through different sections. Usually there's a sense of like a lack of key stability there. Usually the end of that development section, their key becomes stable, usually on that 5, that chord that's on the 5th note of the opening scale. Sitting there, and 5s acoustically and psychologically like to resolve back to the 1. And so that sets up the final section, which is the recapitulation, which would be basically a repeat of the opening section, with the exception that what was the second theme is now kept in the same key as the first theme. So that whereas the exposition begins in one key, ends in the second key, the recapitulation will begin in the usually in the first key, and then end in the first key also. Though there are all sorts of variations of sonata forms, some of them where if you bring in your recapitulation on the 4th scale degree, on the key of the 4th scale degree, and then you leave the first and second theme in the same relationship, the 5th note of the 4th scale degree actually ends up being the 1 of the beginning, so you automatically get back into your home key without even changing anything. But usually composers would start in the 1 and then recompose something in the middle so that the second theme comes in the opening key. And so essentially that's kind of like what how the academics analyze sonata form, and for the most part that works pretty well. Though I would say that all of these things in a real sonata, especially by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, they were much more integrated. It wasn't like composers said, I wrote a first theme and then thought, let's see, I need a second theme, and sit there and ponder and then come up with another melody and put that in. Now I need to write a little transition passage. Let's see, I got to modulate. How do I do that? And do that. Now I need a closing theme. It sounds too mechanical, a little bit too paint by the numbers. It's not really how they thought about it. It was a much more organic thing where the motifs and the keys sort of grew out of each other and kind of grew according to the needs of the basic emotional and motivic ideas that are in the beginning. So some ideas would need a long time to kind of expand to get to the through the exposition. Some are very terse, and you could make them very, 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 very short. Some emotional ideas needed, as they say, needed a very expansive treatment, and some didn't. Some patterns needed a more expansive treatment, or whatever. So I guess we're also where I think you could think of sonata form coming out of, in some ways, is out of these what they're called short binary forms, like 2-part forms, and they're basically what Bach tended to use in a lot of his dance movements. And essentially, these forms, the first section would be in key 1, you would modulate to a key 2, often that 5 by the end. And then there, in the second section, the B section, there would be a part where the passes through different keys, certain instability of key. There would often be a place where you end up on that 5 at the end, and then there would be a place where you come back to the original key. And that sort of makes sense almost from a sort of narrative standpoint, that one would start somewhere, gradually move away to somewhere else. In the middle there would be more conflict going on, and then at some point there would be this resolution and closure. In the Bach forms, there often was not any sort of literal repetition of the beginning. And, things just tended to kind of be more integrated and just keep evolving. But there'd often be this suggestion of a return at the end that seems like it's sort of like, oh yeah, that feels like it's a recapitulation. Bach would then kind of rewrite it, and the music would be different, but still we would have at least that sense. And then the real difference between what happened there with Bach and the later sonata form composers. In Bach's music, in the Baroque, there tended to be this single affect, emotional affect that pervaded the whole piece. It wasn't about like large contrasts and contrasts of emotion, contrast of motif was not really a part of Bach's style. You can think of any piece that you know of Bach, you know that there are often these little figurations that kind of go on, or rhythms that sort of repeat all the way through the piece, a dotted rhythm such as or something like that little Bach prelude, which is just about that one rhythm all the way through. And this also goes on with this sort of what the music at the time was, probably expressing. Bach, growing up in the end of the 17th century and living most of his mature life in the early 18th century, coming from that era where the natural order of political order and social order had stayed more or less the same for quite a while, with the rulers, the kings and queens and princes and the aristocracy at the top, and a sort of a relatively smallish middle class, and then the peasants, the tradesmen, and then the peasants. Everything was very, 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 very stratified. People didn't travel out of their classes very much. They didn't travel in general they didn't move around very much. I mean, Bach came from a family of musicians, and it was taken for granted that was the family's trade, and all of the sons and daughters were trained to, in some way, take part in that. It just so happened that Johann Sebastian really had that incredible ability and distinguished himself. But the cousins and all of that were just people who supplied music to whatever town that they lived in. And in some ways, that lack of these sort of contrasting ideas, things have been this way, they've always will be this way. The aristocracy on top, and then God and heaven above everything else, this order in the world. With the Enlightenment coming in the mid-18th century, and the sort of the breakdown of that order, people became more socially mobile in Europe. There's a chance of working your way up and down from one class to the other. People moved around a lot more. People were immigrating to America. They were looking for new opportunities. I guess one thing on that Bach, we don't actually know all that much about Bach as a person, because he never traveled and never wrote letters to anyone. He just was in the town that he lived in all the time. So we don't have any of those sort of personal writings from him that we get from other composers who are corresponding to people in other countries and were traveling themselves and writing back to their friends and family. And then also from the Enlightenment, rather than there being this fixed order, there's now this idea that there were ideas in the world, a more scientific, logical way of trying to understand the world. And that you could see things that were opposites and they didn't make sense, and we had to come to some sort of way of synthesizing them and making sense, and that is how we might make some progress in our knowledge of things. And also, right around this time, because there was a little bit more sort of growing prosperity in Europe, there was a bigger middle class, and the rather complex music that Bach and Handel and other Baroque composers were writing, this new middle class didn't have the training or the background to appreciate it. They needed something simpler. And what could be simpler rather than this complex sort of intricate counterpoint? We could just have big contrasts, and it'd be a much more dramatic style. And there's this feeling also that we move from the beginning, we start somewhere, there's this gradual synthesis, a growth, these different ideas influence each other, they kind of meld and they come out the other end with a whole different feeling. And that actually is probably one of the, I think, best ways I feel to kind of understand the Beethoven sonatas. Very often in the very, very first line of the piece, there are these opposing ideas put in, both motivic and emotional. I mean, sometimes just ascending and descending sort of lines, but they both have a certain emotional idea behind them. And how those things are combined later on in the piece are what make the music and what make it so interesting. And that's why it kind of carries us forward in this way, where we feel like, oh, I'm really in a different place now after 2 pages of the piece than where we started. And often at the very end of the sonatas, we feel like that we're really, been sort of transformed in some way. So I talked about those little binary forms of Bach, and essentially, if you took those forms and we said that instead of getting the interest from the intricacy, the counterpoint, these little changes, if we were going to get some of our contrast from adding more material, getting just dramatic contrast. If you add extra contrast in it, essentially those binary forms, we end up with something that has to be longer than these 2-page things that Bach often wrote, because you need more time to reconcile and explore all these differences. And we end up spending more time in the various key areas. And it takes more time to combine all of these things together. We essentially, I think, would end up with something like that ends up being sonata form. And I think a great deal of what ended up as Beethoven's approach to sonata form just comes from that. He has set up these contrasts, and they almost had to write the piece for them, for themselves. From Beethoven's standpoint, there definitely was an understanding that there was something like a second theme. In Beethoven's sketches, he actually called it the middle idea. That was meant to be a place that was sort of like an arrival place that is contrasting with the opening. And he definitely referred to the development section as the free fantasia. And then, of course, the recapitulation, too. Other elements that kind of went into sonata form, concerti were one of the big things of sort of public music. That sort of sense of virtuosity is another thing that kind of got in there. In concerti in general, all these sort of forms kind of were written almost symbiotically. They all kind of influenced each other. It's not like they were a different form. But one of the things that would happen in a concerto is that there would often be greater virtuosity through the course of the first section as the soloists separated themselves from the orchestra and played more and more difficult and more showy passages. And so very often in the expositions of sonatas, there's a greater virtuosity as you move on. Not always, but that's often a thing that's true. The little closing theme that I talked about before, that probably came in from concerto, and this is sort of maybe going back to Baroque concerto grosso. You have these alternate orchestral parts and the solo parts. Is that often after the soloists play, the orchestra will play something that kind of like ties that all together and sets up the new section. And so those little closing themes often have that sort of role in the sonata form. So what I think I'd like to do right now is I'd like to play a Bach prelude that shows one of these little binary forms. And also, since Beethoven would have played these pieces for himself when he worked with Neffa in 1785, these were things that probably got into his consciousness, and I think there's a definite influence in how his music is so integrated, and then Beethoven is so integrated too motivically, but has those extra ideas put in. In fact, one of the things that Beethoven said was he wanted to always keep his idea, his mind keep the principal idea in mind, which goes against, in some ways, these sort of things we're talking about, sort of contrast, just arbitrary contrast that you would think that you get in a sonata form which is the academic description of it. And where did Beethoven get that idea? Perhaps it's from Bach, because again, these Bach pieces always have this one idea that they just explore in great depth. And so as a setup to all of this, I'd like to play the prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier in F minor from Book 2. And it's in F minor, the key of this first Opus 2, number 1 sonata I'm going to look at. And it even has some motivic similarities to the sonata, and who knows, maybe it was something that was percolating in Beethoven's mind when he thought of this sonata. So in this, the opening. That's our opening motif. We get a point where the first section ends. And there's our ending of the first section. We have now modulated. In this case, from F minor, we've actually modulated to the relative major, which is A flat major. Basically, relative keys are the keys that have the same key signature, basically the same notes, but you start on a different place in the scale, and you get a sort of the minor mode, which sounds different. But typically, minor key pieces tend to go to the relative major more often than to the note that's the 5, or to the key that's the 5. So then after that, there is a section where he starts in A flat major. And then, interestingly, he goes through a whole bunch of different keys. There's sort of a flux, change of keys, just as you would get in that sonata development. And then there's a point that we will feel that's definitely a sort of recapitulation. It'll be like... Which, again, we get that feeling. Bach gives enough of a hint of the opening melody that we feel we're there. But he goes on and does something different. Bach wasn't as, everything was a little more integrated and always constantly evolving in Bach. Interestingly, this piece in that sort of middle section, in the beginning of the B section, it goes to similar keys to where Beethoven actually goes in the first movement of the Opus 2, number 1 sonata. They both end up touching significantly on B flat minor. And another reason why maybe there's some similarity between these two. Anyway, I hope everyone can hear in that there's almost a sort of a nescent sonata form, contained in that piece. Again, if we just add, like that our basic premise is sort of contrast and add all sorts of different figurations to a piece like that, it would basically turn into a sonata form. And I think that's a good way to kind of understand how these things are, but also knowing the sort of the external conventions that composers adhered to. Let's see. So at this point, let's move on to actually looking at Beethoven's Opus 2 Number 1 Sonata. So I hope everyone's had a chance to listen to the performance that I posted already. But in case you haven't, just so we know what we're all talking about, excuse me, I'll play the exposition from that, so you know what's going on here. And in that, I think one can hear very easily the emotional change that happens throughout that short exposition of just a page and a half. I'd like to look at that all in greater depth about how Beethoven achieves that and what's inside this thing and how it gets there. So in this piece, if we look at the very, very beginning, the first that first theme, the first 8 bars or so. There's an incredible amount of drama there. There's an incredible amount of contrast. A huge amount of sort of development and synthesis has already happened. There are also a large number of motifs and ideas, a hugely concentrated number of motifs and ideas that's like hidden in these 8 bars. It often comes up with people who are working on these pieces, students who are playing them. Often they say the pieces are very, very hard to start, and that beginning seems where they kind of have a lot of trouble playing. And that's because the openings are very, very complex, and there's a lot of detail in them. Even though it seems very, very simple on the surface, they're basically the entire thing that the whole sonata movement is based on. Everything is there in that opening. So if we look at the elements that we have there, we have this rising arpeggio. We have this little thing, that little turn, kind of the end of a trill. We also can look at it in all sorts of ways. We can look at, there's also 4 descending notes. This is an arpeggio. These are descending, and they're scales. So already in this, we have 2 real opposite things. Something that's very regular, ascending, arpeggio. Something very irregular and tight and fast. That's descending and is a scale. In the left hand, we have first of all, we have basically, it's almost like a rhythmic thing. And we have these sort of very simple harmonies, but these are also sort of like the harmonies that will define the rest of the piece. Even the voicings that he has there, I mean, these very, very close voicings, kind of thick, but not too big. A certain thinness that's in these, and that open fifth that we have there. That type of either kind of opaque thickness and this slightly rightly higher kind of thinner sort of sonority. That's also the language, the what's setting up the whole language of this piece. Now already in this, there's again a huge amount of stuff that's happening here. This thing, which it looks like it's a different thing, but already it's a rhythmic development of these basically starting on a weak beat in a series of quarter notes. Instead of starting on the end, this piece is in 2/2, so on the end of 2, this one starts on the end of 1. So already it's a development. He's taking that rhythm, and instead of being bum bum, it's now onto the second beat, bum bum. And so it has that same weak, strong, but when you're going to the 1, the downbeats, it's a much stronger one, and this one's a little bit weaker. Next thing we have, those first 2 phrases. The first one's on that F minor arpeggio. The second one is on a dominant 7th arpeggio on C. So basically a 1 and a 5 for those of you who have some, understand some theory. And each of them are 2 measures each. The next 4 bars we have 1 and then 5 and then 1 5 1 5. And so, I mean, sometimes it's just hinted at in there. And this is already a developmental technique that's called foreshortening, where basically you kind of take the melodies, these motifs that are 2 measures and 2 measures, and then make them 1 measure each, and then collapse them down into half a measure each, and then finally a half a measure for the entire thing. So this whole basically this outlines that sort of 6th. When you get to the foreshortening thing, that little grace note version is taking all that stuff and abbreviating it into that. And then here's that course, and then this, in some ways, this rolled chord is just the abbreviation for that whole first part. And then we have that on the 5, and then this feels almost like it's a 1 5 also. It's right there. And now the next thing to kind of look at is also from this, one other thing that's important is from that thing starting on the offbeat, eventually he leaves out all the other notes and just has that offbeat start here. And so those are these syncopated chords where there are no downbeats, everything's on the offbeat. So he has developed and generated a new idea by kind of breaking apart that rhythmic idea that's there, that's actually in the opening theme. And then he will use that as a motivic thing later on. So that everything that shows up later in the piece, it's not something that, oh, here's a nice new idea. He makes it gradually grow slowly, organically from everything in a way that's almost imperceptible to us. And I think that's the greatness and the incredible beauty of these pieces. That's why they affect us so much, because they work in this sort of subliminal way. We don't even know what's happening, and then suddenly it seems like it's just the right thing. And it's because we've been prepared for this for the last 20 measures or 2 pages or 2 lines. And sometimes in Beethoven there could be things that happen in the very beginning of a piece in the first movement that later on in his later music that he doesn't resolve till later on in at the end of the final movement even. So the next thing I want to deal with is the sort of emotional progression here, which is probably the most important thing that we feel in this opening. This there couldn't be anything more sort of just generic, just energetic, driving forward, but it doesn't have any, there's nothing personal about it. In fact, that opening theme is kind of like a, it was almost one of these generic themes that every composer of the time used at least once. It was a little bit like things like hunting horns in Mozart and Haydn. Those horn sounds, everyone used them, everyone knew that what the illusion was. But this, Mozart using a symphony, it's a motif actually. And I actually found something by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the most important son of Johann Sebastian, a place where he used it, but I'm sure I could find many, many more. Let's see if I can play it. I think it's interesting to hear it if I can find it. Oh, it's at the very beginning, so I can find it. So it was like. To show how composers would use this thing. And everyone knew that that was called the Mannheim rocket theme, named after Mannheim in Germany. Anyway, so very generic, no particular emotional connotation thing other than just general energy and maybe strength or something, rising, maybe a little bit optimistic. This suddenly has a lot of inner tension in it because of the rhythms and that quick little tight little turn at the end. Also that it's descending. It has kind of a more of a, it's not a sighing quality, but has an emotional letdown kind of quality after the, almost a disappointment after that sort of optimistic Mannheim rocket theme. And then, as he does the foreshortening, this part, the rocket part, gets abbreviated. And the descending part, the more impassioned part, becomes more and more prominent. And then at the end, he actually has this development where this now turns into this impassioned, almost, romantic kind of theme. Where here, there's just that little seed of it in that. And so he's almost taken that sort of energy and expansiveness from the Mannheim rocket theme and combined it with this little tight theme, this descending notes, and turned it into something more and more impassioned, basically by giving something that has in essence kind of impassioned emotionality, making it bigger, give more energy to it, feeding it, and it turns into this almost operatic gesture there. Let's see if I think that covers everything that's in that first section. Every time I look at these things, I realize, oh, there's even more going on there. But I think that'll be enough to give everyone the idea about how complex that is. And then that this ends with a little note with a fermata on that. I mean, that's incredibly dramatic. It almost, for me, it almost brings back the silence that's at the beginning of the piece. It also sets up that after that, we're going to go to something totally different. Now here we have the same theme as the beginning, exactly. But after that sort of impassioned statement and that fermata that just like dissipated all of that optimistic energy of the Mannheim rocket theme, now this key, he brings it in a different key. He brings it in C minor rather than F minor. He brings it lower in the lower in the register of the piano. It gives it a much more kind of maybe almost sad. Can we call it a questioning, slightly pessimistic kind of feel, a more in between kind of feeling. And so that's another development. Whereas the more impassioned theme is now affecting and has changed and transformed the emotional context of the Mannheim Rocket theme. Also the fact that he uses it, one of the other reasons that gives it that from a technical standpoint, that sort of feeling. F minor, the C is on the 5, but usually the 5 chord would be major. As we listen to the 5, it really likes to resolve back to the 1. But when we go to the minor 5, it doesn't have that strong resolution. It doesn't have that energy to it. It feels like almost like it's disappointing. It doesn't know where to go in a way. So he's okay, we've got to this closely related key, 3 flats instead of 4 flats, but it's giving us this sense of mystery. I don't know quite what's happening. Uncertainty, perhaps, is a better word to use for that. Following that, so here you can obviously see how this motif is thrown around between the voices. This is all stuff written in kind of like, 4 parts. It's almost like a string quartet texture, which is another thing to kind of point out that Beethoven used that made his piano writing so interesting and radical and different, is that he'd often use different textures, like styles that allude to different media. Whereas the beginning part, fairly pianistic, these thick chords only really exist on the piano, but it also is kind of vaguely symphonic or whatever. But this part is very much a 4-part string quartet texture. And then later on there might be allusions to things that could be, a more choral style, or it could sound like a violin and piano sonata, or whatever. But this stuff, from this kind of dark feeling, he's gradually modulating to A flat major, to the relative major, and there's a gradual sort of warming that happens to the piece emotionally. And so in some ways he's made it dark from this. He's had that influence, the Mannheim Rocket, to make it darker, but now that sort of energy that's in the piece, that energy is almost like influencing the thing in kind of a more positive way, or a more lightning kind of way. There's a scherzando thing to this that's in that. There is something interesting or playful to that. And so by throwing it around between the voices, he's finding that sort of, somewhere embedded in that theme, there's a playful side to it. And that causes this sort of warming here. Which has this feeling like that it could go either way. Is it going to move to some major or minor? Is it going to be dark? Is it going to be light? And he keeps repeating himself. He doesn't quite tell us. The way that he gets there, he sort of repeats it. The second one almost like, oh, come on, let's go here. But we're not getting it. The last one ends up being kind of vehement. Because it's vehement, it almost negates that sort of lightness that's there. And so we feel that he's kind of touched on something lighter and then teased us, and we went back to something dark. If we look at these things, this motif, I mentioned that, and it's like 4 or more descending notes. That's what these are, the 4 descending notes. And then he extends it up, to 6 descending notes, which is just a way of building something more from the pre-existing materials. Anyway, this thing then brings us to the second theme. So here's the second theme. And it's a very interesting second theme. It is more or less in A flat, which is the relative major, but very interestingly, he sits on the 5. He sits on E flat, which is the 5 of A flat, and never really. That's kind of the dominant 7th of A flat, and it should leave there. And the only resolution we get to A flat is just that one note that is staccato. It's incredibly sort of. It feels it has this darkness there, but it's also very, very playful and playing with our expectations. It feels like it's going to resolve to A flat, and he gives us A flat for like 1/8 note, and then goes on. It's also A flat is kind of resolved in the wrong inversion. That isn't final. It's in second inversion, so it really doesn't even mean that we're in A flat. But it gives us that taste of it. We could be going there, but then he goes back. And so there are incredible number of different little ups and downs that are in this theme. This lowered note here gives a very minor quality to it, and that real dissonance there also gives a kind of that sort of bitter, sour quality to it. But then we get that moment of major, and so as I say, he's playing with our expectations in a wonderful way. He's riding on that edge of. We could just call it happy and sad or whatever, and make it something very simple as that. But he can right on that knife's edge and can hold us there in that suspended place. There are two sides to way of looking at everything, and you never know. It's a way that our own emotions kind of evolve from moment to moment. They're never sort of pure emotions. Everything is always in evolution, and there's always a touch of something else even in our happiest moments. Next thing about this second theme is talking about that we can't say that from the sort of academic sonata form, it sounds like composers would write a second theme and they'd write a new melody. Sounds like Beethoven wrote a new melody here. But what is this melody actually made from? If we notice the rhythm of it, bum 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 ba bum. Same rhythm as the opening theme exactly. Other than this, he changed that figuration. He made it less complicated, but it has that same feeling, like something with a dotted held note and then that quick thing moving to the resolution. So basically we're on this thing mostly going down in arpeggio now, and then up on this thing, on this little ending part. So essentially, rather than going up the arpeggio and then going down on this sort of playful dotted rhythm, he's going down the arpeggio and then up the ending. And so in a sense, all this is just kind of an inversion of the opening idea of the piece. And in some ways standing it on its head, in that the first one had such a clear, forthright emotion. This one has got this sort of very convoluted, complex kind of bittersweet emotion. And so he's entirely transformed these simple motifs. And also he's keeping us sort of in expectation, that sort of sense that things are suspended and we're going to have that expectation that goes back to that fermata that happens after the first phrase, where we get that impassioned theme and then he just stops. So it's like, no, that's not really what we're expecting. We thought we'd get some nice thing, big and operatic, but not. And so he has set that up from before, earlier in the piece. So then at the end of this section, can certainly hear that we're getting more and more this sort of sense of like expectation. Something exciting is going to happen. He's looking more at the scherzando element of this. There's so many things going on here. This little motif, the rhythm of that, well, that's that same thing starting the offbeat going to a strong beat, except now he's done what would be called a rhythmic diminution of that. And instead of it being in quarters, it's made twice as fast as it was, but it still has that same relationships, all the notes of weak beat going to a stronger beat, and then it ends on another beat. Even this little tight little third thing certainly comes from or from, but mostly I think it's probably a derivation of using those three, or really from where he turns it over at the end of the first phrase. Yeah, there's one little thing that I missed at the end of the first phrase. That he turn that upside down. It looks like just a little ornament on the page, but it's actually the opening, that thing being turned upside down. And he's also alluding to that sort of playfulness that he was kind of bringing into it there. You know, changing the order of the notes instead of they're now. Anyway, I could probably find layers and layers of this stuff, and we could be here all night. So try to avoid that. So again, the music opens up. Okay, and then it gets to this almost heroic, triumphant sort of climactic point. Oh, one thing I do want to mention is that the voicings of those thin voicings that are not in root position, those are going back to the voicings that he was using in the second line of the piece that I mentioned before. And so again, another thing that's the vocabulary of the piece. Everything refers back to those opening lines. And now, where does this stuff come from? First, a number of places that comes from. That's partially the syncopation idea we had. The heavily accented second quarter of the beat, and leaving out the more heavily accented full second beat of the 2/2. This is certainly alluding back to the opening of the opening Mannheim Rocket theme. And also, the other thing about that, immediately before that, were all of these voicings of the, I was alluding to there, of those are just, regular triads. Those actually are very similar to those chords in their voicing and feel that I was just talking about. So again, because the all of these things that are showing up here are already, the things they're directly derived from are already 2 steps removed from what happens at the beginning. But still, everything relates back to those first few measures. This, we can obviously see we've had these, which are related to the, and all of that. And then the descending notes now just turn into a scale. And these are part of the, that three note motif sort of thing. And finally, that is, I think, kind of really alluding back to the You get that sort of feeling. One other interesting thing that Ty is talking about, how in the second theme, he never gives us A flat. In that sort of build up to this part, he still never gives us A flat in a sort of really solid way. It's always what's called, it'll always have these sort of like little, he might have like a little incidental cadence where it arises. It sits on the first inversion of A flat, which is not very final. Here, feels like he might be getting something more final, but we still don't get A flat in root position. This actually sounds like we're about to get there. This is the 5 of A flat, but we still don't get it. Right there. That's the first time we get the root position. That's the first time we are solidly, can say we are solidly, have finally cadenced in A flat. And interestingly, he does it just with a bare octave, just to allow a little bit of ambiguity. Because if he went to, we would feel like that's an ending, it's final. This allows, okay, we need a little bit more explanation to kind of finish this out. Okay, so now we get our little closing theme. First I would remind us that this now has that sort of energy and a sort of a triumphant quality. Everything is kind of relaxing. Everything is becoming resolved. And so again, that's kind of like that warming, the playfulness that's sort of developed in the middle. Add that to sort of like the energy of the Mannheim rocket theme, and that almost turns that emotion into something strong and sort of triumphant, and again very happy and relaxed. And we have that feeling, okay, everything is resolved. All the conflicts that we have had, they've all been resolved here. And this closing thing has this sort of feeling of just, let's bring it all to a close. Everything's great. Of course, if we look at how it's put together, in the bass, we have those syncopated chords that we developed in the beginning. There's that foreshortened version of the Mannheim rocket theme that we had there. And then in some ways, this is the end, the dotted rhythm. So it goes back to, it's basically an illusion of that, except now that it's in the new key of A flat, and instead of it having a sort of a more distressed feeling, it has this very, calm, everything's great sort of feeling. And here, for once, there's no real development in the piece. It's just a repetition. He repeats the same phrase twice. Just like, okay, we are calm now, it's stable. We are coming to the end. I don't have to kind of change. I'm not fooling you with your expectations anymore. He just goes up to a higher range and gives us a much more intensified, slow down version of the ending of the theme. So instead of and that long note, in some ways, they say, for me, I think, where we heard that before, that's that long rest. That feeling of like suspension in a moment that he's introduced there. And that's why this makes sense. There's no other whole note in the piece. There's no other thing that's held long like that. But that's why I think that seems so inevitable there. So anyway, there is a little sort of talking through of this first sonata. I guess I have to also mention that of the first three sonatas of the Opus 2, and next week I'll talk about the 2 number 2 and the 2 number 3, even though this one is by far the smallest, the others are very ambitious pieces and 25, 26 minutes long, symphonically scaled, much more difficult to play, pianistically much showier, full of all sorts of very, very difficult figurations that I think show there's almost Beethoven putting into them all of his special technical developments that he was kind of known for, almost like he's taking possession of them in a publication so no one else can use them. This piece is actually rather modestly scaled technically. It doesn't have a lot of notes. It's not very symphonic in its style. It seems like a much less ambitious piece. But this is the piece that, the way that it's put together, is very much like Beethoven's later music, the sort of complexity that this has, these complex interrelationships between everything. This is how, this really is his style in a small scale. And as we look through all the sonatas, often the sonatas were written in groups. They're often, Opus 2, number 3, the Opus 10s are a group. Even some of the later sonatas, you could say, oh, these kind of group together. But when he did write sonatas in a group at the same time, often there's one sonata that's lighter and much less ambitious than the others. And the interesting thing is often that's the one where he's working on where he's going to go to in later sonatas. That's where the techniques sort of show up. The things that he isn't ready to maybe do on the grand scale yet, he's sort of trying them out. He's feeling his way through on a smaller, less ambitious scale. And so, in some ways, of the Opus 10 sonatas, that's going to be Opus 10 number 1 that really has that. Okay, maybe I can talk relatively briefly about the rest of this sonata. So again, we get to the development section, which opens with the theme now in the beginning in A flat major. And there we have the theme in the key that we ended up in, that relative major. He uses these sort of, some of those things again are things that are developments of stuff I didn't talk about in the beginning part. That diminished sonority, also in that particular third inversion, that's kind of weaker than some of the others as far as how it sounds. There's like some chromatic notes, like in rising chromatic notes that developed in there I didn't touch on, and there's a descending chromatic line that takes us to the new key, and that's also it's also built into there too. But here he modulates to B flat minor, which I was talking about. He has this in common with that's the first thing that Bach prelude does that I did before. So he gets to B flat minor, but then he plays the melody in different keys. And now C minor. Develops the theme by kind of inverting everything around. We call it invertible counterpoint. It's sort of something to a young composer to want to show off because he just learned it in his studies. And again, sequential, going through different keys. It's difficult to kind of write a melody when you have invertible counterpoint. That's where you can take what's in the upper part and the lower part and switch them. And so it's hard to have something that actually can work as a bass line that's also a melody, and that's where the skill is involved, right now, invertible counterpoint. This little next part here it's kind of like, it's an interesting and unusual section. It's almost like the music almost deconstructs itself. It loses any sort of sense of melody, and it just becomes almost pure rhythm, which is another thing that's characteristic to Beethoven, that he used rhythm as a sort of a developmental device and as a unifying thing, even more than any other composer. I always remember I once had a teacher say to me, say to the class once, like, who do you think of as like the composer that's the most rhythmic of everyone? And certainly people often they mentioned Stravinsky, and obviously that's a very, very obvious one, or something like Bartok or whatever. And he said, well, he wanted to kind of like put in the mix that maybe the greatest one, or the one that rhythm is most prominent in, is Beethoven. And I think one looks at that in his music, the role that it plays, and the interesting developmental things that happen with rhythm. I think that could actually be, very, very much one can make an argument for that. But anyway, this is basically that sort of syncopation idea is there, the sforzandos and these sort of odd places. We noticed that Beethoven had a thing with sometimes taking melodies and making them twice as fast. Here's a place where he takes little melodic fragments and makes them like 3 times as slow. Because right here he has this little, and here he has that upper voice. Is that thing, which is made much, much slower, almost to the point where we almost don't even hear it as connecting to that. But that's a device called rhythmic augmentation. Anyway, it's this interesting. It almost feels like the whole thing is kind of like falling apart. But having these rhythm things, rather than giving more energy, they almost put the brakes on the whole thing. The piece is kind of moving forward and through these different keys. There's a lot of momentum, but this is a thing that kind of like, because everything is on the offbeats, it kind of like slows everything down. This part here. That's the recapitulation right there, where the opening comes back. This last section, as I talked about, a common thing that happens in sonatas and in Bach and everywhere, is that there's a sense that the harmonies will often sit on the F5, which after all that changing of key is kind of putting the brakes on everything, and it also is setting up in our subliminally that we feel like, oh, 5, it's sitting here in 5, it's not going anywhere, where's it going to go? This sort of little bit of discomfort that we have. And then when it kind of resolves back to the, we feel this immense sort of satisfaction. We've arrived back at the beginning. We feel this sort of sense of closure because of that. And so like that C just stays as the bass note on the left hand for 3 lines here. Okay? And also he's not doing a lot developmentally here, which we can see are like related to most of the motifs that we already had before he had that that half step rising, how he's like making it descending. Then he varies it, puts a trill on it, and then extends it out. Less is happening here, giving us that sense we're calming down, we're preparing for the return. And then that last part with this sort of real dissonance, again, it has those descending seconds that we've been seeing a lot of in the development section. He's throwing around that theme that he actually used it to kind of like, he brought out, the last time we heard it, it was used in this play that brings out a little bit of that sort of playfulness. But by bringing it with these sort of very dissonant harmonies, it's bringing it back to that sort of slightly impassioned kind of feeling that it has at the beginning. And then when we get to the recapitulation, when would think that the recapitulating would just be a mechanical reiteration of the opening, which in a lesser composer, that is what would happen. But for Beethoven, he found ways to make these repetitions into something compelling and great. So this recapitulating, the way he brings it in with all that harmonic tension before that, it's the same thing. But he takes out some of the syncopations and makes his left hand's right on the beat. It makes the whole thing seem much more vehement, and makes the whole thing seem much more impassioned right from the beginning. We don't have that evolution from that sort of generic to the impassioned. Though on the other hand, it also makes it feel like that sort of evolution is all in the past, and now we have to move forward from that. Is in some ways he's opening up what happened on the first two lines of the piece, which in some ways he went in other directions in the exposition. And now he's recalling that and saying, remember where we were here? We can approach this a little bit differently in the recapitulation. And so just from the fact that the recapitulation of the second theme is now in F minor rather than A flat major, the F minor is much darker sounding than the A flat major. We now kind of get to explore that like slightly bitter passion that was inherent in the opening of the theme. That sort of slightly severity that's in the Mannheim rocket theme. And so this part here, that again had a little bit of an opening up of the emotion. It's almost like this is almost more intense. We're not going very far from what happens in the opening here. And then as it builds up, there's almost a feeling of now that theme, which before was so expectant, we had this sense of expectation. Now it feels there's almost a sense of resignation to it, because we're in F minor and we don't have that feeling we're going anywhere now. It's like we're going to F minor, we're staying in F minor. Everything is sort of done. In some ways, there's a pessimism to it, that all that optimism of the opening that we first had is now behind us, and we're back to that sort of that quality that the piece opened with. So now. That theme that we had that was the climactic place before in the exposition, now it has again a little bit of that sort of generic severity that the Mannheim rocket theme has, that almost energy and passion, but it isn't taking us anywhere. And then that sense of again a sense of sort of resignation there. And then there's one final outburst. That little ending that recalls that whole note there, but now it's transformed again into this sort of, as I say, almost distressed kind of impassioned kind of feeling, with a lot of dissonance in it. I talked about that there were those and descending seconds and all of that. It's almost like they've almost taken over those things that became prominent in the development section. And that descending second that's from the first theme, that's almost become the sonority that's taken over this ending. And again, given it almost a sort of a impassioned sort of bitterness to the whole thing. Things were great, and they're not so great now. We started with something, and there was a great deal of optimism, but it ended with that we haven't actually achieved anything at all. Okay, end of the first movement, and again, I intend not to talk quite as at length without the other movements. We could be here all night. But there's a point I want to make is that these sonatas have so much in them to even come close to explaining what's there. It just takes hours. So again, I mentioned the theme of the second movement, comes from one of those early quartets he wrote when he was 15. The interesting thing is, one way or another, what this is built from, it's actually some of the same motifs that are in the first movement. We have that, which is the, and then those descending, those just descending notes. It's the same thing. Even that little turn is just a variation on the. So I would say, did Beethoven kind of, what shall I say, he knew he wanted to use this melody in his second movement, and maybe he sort of, what should I say, reverse engineered the first movement to be built out of the same motifs. But either way, it's all pretty much very obvious. It's all the same things. Again, I can go through all of this and talk about sort of the derivation of every melody from something else. I just want to talk about it more in a more general way. After that sort of heroic tension of the first movement, this the second movement has an idyllic quality, a peaceful, a calm, a sort of a loving, sort of consoling nature that it has. It's much closer to sort of like an operatic aria in its sort of style. It's very, very vocal. There are a lot of little ornamentations, a lot of little turns and trills, the kind of things that opera singers in Beethoven's time would probably have added to arias as a matter of course. And obviously, Beethoven grew up around the court and played in the orchestra while numerous operas were played, and his father was an opera singer himself, so he would have been imbued with this general style. A very simple, very, very heartfelt piece. As Beethoven said about his late Mass, the Missa Solemnis, one of his last pieces that he wrote, one of his greatest pieces, he finished in 1823. As complex as that piece was, he's just said about it, from the heart, let it go to the heart. And in this very, very simple piece, I think the same sentiment applies, even though it's as different as it possibly could be from that late Missa Solemnis. The first section ends. There's this. It sounds almost like a second verse of an operatic aria there. The first part's idyllic, the second part is something more, more distressed or more uncertain or more impassioned or whatever. And certainly the way that's laid out, pianistically, very, very interestingly. It's almost orchestral. You've got this little accompaniment, and then the melody ranges around it, almost like with these giant leaps, which a vocalist couldn't do, but the sentiment is like when you have a big leap vocally, it's something that's dramatic and heightened, heightened awareness or heightened emotional feeling. Anyway, that kind of builds up to. this almost like cathartic point where it builds up, and then it comes up almost with this sense of like relief and of resolution, and almost astonishment that we could be at this point. And then that leads into this little closing idea. Which is then repeated in an ornamented version. And again, with that sort of idea of like everything's been resolved now, and let's just kind of like bask in the warmth of that very, very beautiful emotion. So then that ends, and then the opening theme comes back. The rest of the piece is just a repetition of the first section, except he leaves out that sort of impassioned theme. And everything is ornamented, as I say, in a sort of like a very vocal way, adding little chromatic things to things, adding a little trill here and there, connecting notes with 16th notes, connecting two notes together. Where something might have been in 16ths, now it's a run of 32nd notes or whatever. Beethoven was an incredible master of variation technique, how to meaningful change pieces around. And this is an example in his very first piano sonata of, they say, the second part is a variation. But really probably is much more of, rather than kind of like thinking of that, I think it's much more a allusion to what an operatic aria would be. And again, those things are things that end up, especially in the sonata slow movements. Some of his later sonatas, the slow movements are written in a sonata form, but very much often with these sort of aria elements mixed in. Here one can barely argue there could be a sonata form. That sort of impassioned section is in D minor, the relative minor, but that would be an unusual place to go for a second theme. It's almost like a little sort of B section that he then varies later on. But still, it does have that kind of pattern where there's a little bit more going to another key, and there's a little bit more flux of different keys, and then we come back, and then stability towards the end of it. And this certainly does end, the first section does end in C major, and there's a very, very brief thing that takes us back to the F major beginning. So again, a lot of these sonata things are in this. I'll mention the little ending of the movement. In that he first has that repetition of a motif to just like bring everything, calm everything down, tell us it's the end, no new things are happening. Let's live in that sort of glow and bask in the emotional glow of the beauty of this movement. But at the very end, he brings us that little, that strong dissonance, almost to kind of like remind us of, well, this is what happened in the first movement. It also ties together that dissonance. Shows up several times in the course of the movement. Again, that the moral of the story is that every little sort of incidental thing that we see in these sonatas, there's something, it's going to show up later. He has a purpose that he put it there. And so again, that little, that then shows up in the end, just to kind of really tie it together. And also bringing back those strong dissonances prepares us for the third movement that's back to F minor and is bringing back sort of the mood of the opening movement. Even though it feels idyllic and charming and almost teasing the way that he does it, it's almost like this little, almost a sobbing farewell to the idyllic mood, of sort of a nostalgic feel to it. It's structurally, with that sort of like little minor key sort of illusion there, sets us up that when the third movement comes in the minor, we are ready for it, and it doesn't seem like, what are we doing back in minor? So, the third movement is a minuet. As I mentioned, the courtly dance in 3-time, kind of dignified, rather slow to moderate in pace, typical in these sort of 4-movement songs, 4-movement sonatas. This would be what the third movement would be. And Beethoven would have known that well from his years at the Bonn court. And interestingly, he kept these sort of light-hearted dance movements in his music. I mean, they show up, throughout his middle period pieces, and they often have this very, very fond, nostalgic character, even though they're very old-fashioned, and they don't go along with the rest of his aesthetic, which is much more progressive and revolutionary and energetic and of the new century. But they often have this wonderful fondness and nostalgia to them. And I think that's him thinking of his childhood, his young years in Bonn, which he throughout his life always recalled with great fondness. And he also recalled all of his friends from, the friends that he grew up with. He recalled them very, very fondly, and seemed to take quite delight in reacquainting himself with them, writing them letters later on in his life, and they have a very valuable place. So again, this brings us back a little bit of that sort of more dour, severe mood of the beginning. And if we look at that motif, we've already found that 3-note third motif. That recalls right back to that. There's our rising, we had those descending scale passages, and now they're just rising, which has happened before in the piece many times. They've been transformed, and those are the basic materials. This thing, this is just the that 6 that we've had kind of turned upside down, and all those rhythms that are in that, again, recall stuff. That's all that goes back to the beginning of the first movement, the descending seconds and all of that. Okay. What's sort of, I guess, notable in this minuet is rather than being truly an elegant, courtly minuet, it has this feeling underneath it of unease and unrest, and that something is going to kind of burst out at some point, which it does. It's very, very restricted. The B section of it, I talked about these sort of binary pieces. It's kind of written in this sort of that binary form that Bach used. The B section goes to other keys, B flat minor again, and again sort of a parallel with that Bach Prelude and Fugue. But that he goes to B flat minor, that he'd already foreshadowed that in the first movement, is insignificant and typical of his procedures. Even what keys he goes to, they're not like, let's go to some new key for variety. They always refer back to something else in the piece. So here's the B section. B flat minor. So he keeps it kind of held in, it's going to different keys, it's dissonant. We need to kind of get some sort of resolution, but keep it pianissimo all the way through. Sforzandos on off beats. Tension builds up. This outburst seems inevitable at that point. And again, a typical Beethovenian procedure that he uses in his big sonatas. The Waldstein works on that in a really, really grand scale. Even in a little movement like this one-page minuet, it has this wonderful manipulation of our expectations and time. Often, by using dynamics, Beethoven builds a lot of suspense and energy. By having the harmonies want to have a lot of energy and forward motion, but keeping the dynamic restricted, and then it suddenly has to burst out because of all the pent-up energy. And then, so anyway, that gives a little bit of idea of like the sort of concentrated energy that's in this minuet. Rather than it being a relaxation, it's almost like let's kind of ramp up the sort of tension. And then the real release in some ways is in the last movement. There's a trio section. Typically minuets always had trios. The trios traditionally was just a contrasting section. Maybe this is where the people didn't dance. You'd kind of sit there and sort of chat for a while and pick a different partner, and then when the minuet comes back, go back and pair up in minuets or in groups again. And so the trio is very freely flowing and really quite beautiful and genial. Again, it has a charm, it has an ease, it has almost a folk-like kind of ease and quality to it. On the other hand, he's using this interesting, at least a suggestion of sort of invertible counterpoint. Kind of reversing the parts like that, these Bach-like procedures. That shows that even in the light-hearted trio, he's not writing something insignificant. Also, a little bit about what the young composer wanting to show his sort of compositional chops would kind of throw something in that way. This builds up. Anyway, almost in a passage that parallels that passage that's in the minuet. This one has sort of a build-up, but this is the opposite. That one has a darkness and a tension that builds up. This one's almost like, let the music just sing and be enthusiastic and joyous, It's exuberant and lighthearted. Maybe one of the again, it's an F major. It's a little bit of a reminiscence of the second movement. Even some of these figurations resemble those that are in the second movement. These little these parallel six like that. These double note techniques. That's things that are as pianistically almost showy stuff like that. That's not stuff that shows up in Beethoven sonatas very often. You see them in kind of some of these early sonatas, the first three, and then they're rare. The next time I think I remember seeing anything like that is in like the Opus 101. There's a very difficult passage in these parallel fourths in the right hand. That's near the end of that sonata. But again, it's basically to give this sort of like exuberance and ease that he's kind of putting in the trio section before we go back to that concentrated minuet. And after the trio, we repeat the minuet. That's the standard thing, is that they're always kind of a pairing minuet trio, and then you go back to the minuet. Final movement, the Prestissimo. First of all, if we look at this piece, it's built out of the same materials that we've been using all the way through. That sort of arpeggio that's from the Mannheim Rocket theme at the beginning. These chords are very much like the chords that are in the opening of the first movement, and the sort of descending that descending second motif that shows up a lot in the. It's in the minuet, and again permeates the other movements. There that is, and even these things. Again, that kind of alludes back to the opening theme, and things like there we have that. that from almost. It's almost a quote of that theme, that thing that's in the eighth measure of the first movement, and there it is. The second theme of this. It's those same three descending little turning theme that turns around itself. It's based on that again. The little closing idea. Those same descending notes that we've had at the beginning. Transformation of them. This movement, as is sort of typical in a lot of final movements, it's written in a somewhat looser sonata form, which doesn't have quite the sort of concentrated development stuff of the first, but it's still very much there. It's like things are repeated a little bit more, so that it gives us this feeling of ease rather than concentration and constant change. Again, there's a little more repetition. And then he actually interestingly uses he brings back the opening theme of that as sort of like the closing gesture of that exposition. And in the key of the 5, we've actually modulated to C minor, which is one of the possibilities of going from F minor. So now we have, in the development section, we feel like we have an entirely new theme. But again, all we have is another permutation of sort of the things that this piece has been about from the beginning. There's the arpeggio for the Mannheim Rocket theme. That's another permutation of the descending seconds that have developed from that. The left hand, where we heard that before. There they are on the first measure of the piece. Are right there. At least rhythmically, that's where they come from. And then again, even the little second phrase of that. Built out of the same materials, the scales, the arpeggio, and the descending themes. This, of course, has much more. That this middle section has much more of a sort of this idyllic quality, and it's less an outgrowth of what happens in the beginning section. It's less of that sort of organic thing. It's more just a little bit of more contrast, just to make it interesting. And again, it goes along with that these last movements are a little looser in their construction. They're not about like these tight sort of arguments about if you have these two ideas, these two emotional ideas, and they clash, or all the ways that we can synthesize them. There's much more just like, this is just easy contrast. Though one could say that that little second part of the first theme in this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of that, at least the key that this is in, of A flat major, the altered major. Anyway, this also has a very, very beautiful, easy, idyllic quality. It repeats. The writing is much simpler. It's much less involved as far as all the motivic interrelationships. It does bring back a little bit of that ease and beauty of the slow movement. One of the most interesting parts of this movement is the second half of the development. This interesting transition back to the opening section. And so it's very clever how he gradually brings back the mood of the opening and brings back the motif. Just by first bringing it in the major, very, very quiet, without the thick chords, very, very delicate, and then he intersperses it with a kind of a more impassioned version of a thing that comes up in the A flat major theme in the development section. And then he brings in, and he gradually moves us back to the minor, gradually kind of brings us back into the mood of that thing, and then where we get to suddenly the harmonies are moving closer. There's this sort of insistence, this sort of rhythmic thing, drive comes back, and that starts to really, really bring us back to the mood at the beginning, and then is a wonderful playing with our expectations, where it's like, well, there's the theme, it's there, again, this sort of invertible counterpoint. Again, being sort of learned, despite this piece, not being one of his heavier pieces. There's also a little bit of we have a hint that maybe we can have a little bit of playfulness, like from a scherzando quality, with the theme getting thrown between the parts. We think we're getting back to that very dramatic beginning, but he's kind of confounding our expectations a little bit. And then also, I talk about often that we have that sitting on the 5 just before these returns. There we are sitting on the 5. It's all 5 there in the bass, and then here he kind of like adds that on the 9th. It's all coming back to the 5, but this is adding more dissonance. Are we going off in some other direction? More dissonance, maybe more is going to happen, but then he calms down. And he uses that extra dissonance to kind of propel us into the return. And then the recapitulation of the piece basically follows the beginning part really, really quite closely, with only a few relatively minor changes. Again, befitting that lack of extra complexity that you often get in these final movements. The only thing, when he had that, using the main theme as the closing, it was bringing us to C minor. Now, going to the main theme as the closing, it now acts as this sort of curtain closing on the entire sonata, bringing us back to F minor. And it's been so F minor, it really ends the whole sonata with this sort of like very, very dramatic, headlong rush, this almost terseness. I'm done with what I would want to say, and ends up with this sort of like, after you play, it's so unexpected, the ending, you have to kind of sit there and hold the rest out and stay still for quite a while after. And then for me, what that does is it refers back to that rest, that sense of stillness that he kind of developed there after that almost cathartic thing, and it almost ties us back again to one other element of the very beginning of the piece. And here's the last little ending now. Okay, so that brings that sonata to an end. I hope you've been able to stay with me for this, rather lengthy explanation of the piece. You'd be certainly welcome to come back and listen to this in segments at different times. Perhaps when I go back over this, I'll find out actually what time it is, because I can't see the clock anywhere here, so I could have been talking here for 2 hours, and maybe I'll break up some of these into shorter segments in the future. But anyway, I hope that gives you sort of an idea of the incredible greatness that's there in even this very first of Beethoven's sonatas. And I think everyone would say, oh yes, among the more modest of his sonatas. But again, they only get more more big and more complex from here. In some ways, the earlier sonatas are more worth going into great detail about how they're constructed, because you actually can see it. You actually won't be so befuddled by how much is going on there. You won't know where to stop or where to start. It's almost like there's an entire universe in all of these things, and you just aren't going to be able to understand it, even if you try. My final thing I'll leave you with is, was Beethoven conscious of all of this in there? I've never been really sure. Is that just how his mind works? These interrelationships just came out organically from his mind, or did he really think through them? As with many things, it's probably some combination of all of that. I've certainly noticed from looking at some of the sketches of the pieces, often these interrelationships don't show up in a really, really great degree until his final version of the piece. They're not there in some of the preliminary sketches. I often thought, let's look at some of the... occasionally he would sketch a second theme, and as he called it, the middle idea. And it would be something different than what he ended up with. And let's see, it's a rejected middle idea. Does it have those interrelationships with the opening theme? And often not to a very, very great degree. That could be why he rejected it, but it also could be that he was often working out these emotional sort of progression of his pieces. And whatever it is, all this sort of complexity of nuance and detail seems to just come in suddenly into focus in his final drafts of the piece. That's a whole other study. Like Beethoven left all of his sketchbooks, and one can really study how these pieces evolved. But something for a future researcher to really look into. Okay, I am going to end there. Thank you for listening, and I will. Looking, I noticed the time. Maybe I'm 2.5 hours. I promise not to make the next one as long as this. Anyway, good night. Thank you, and hope you will join me next Saturday for Opus 2 number 2 and 2 number 3. And also, those pieces will be available. The performance will be available the day before, and so feel free to listen to those at your leisure or before I give my talk. Okay.